In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up a multi-screen iOS application using Xamarin. And multi-screens allow us to have kind of a navigational system within our app, so we can have like a primary screen that shows information with additional screens, one or more, that collect information, or vice versa. So in this app, I'm going to just show you a quick way to gather some information from the user. So we'll look at some input, do a little processing, and then some output on a separate screen so you can see how this should look. So to get started, I am creating a new project under the iOS iPhone section, single view app. Go ahead and give it a name. I'm naming this one iOS Input Output, since that is the point of our lesson today. And go ahead and click OK so Visual Studio can get your project set up. So once my project is open, I typically like to go up to my Mac agent, just double check that I am connected, because if you're not, then you're not going to be able to open the designer. So let's come over to our Solution Explorer. Remember, we're using the main storyboard. So go ahead and give that a double click, and that will open up our UI designer. So once your UI designer is open, just some quick things to get our environment set up. I change my view as to iPhone 6, and then I go ahead and change my debug device to iPhone Simulator, since I am not using a device for testing. Remember, I have my Mac all set up so that I can do my emulation over there. And so I just go ahead and get those two things done so I don't forget as I'm doing my development. So let's go ahead and get our UI set up. This application is going to be designed to take in two pieces of information. We want the user's name, just the first name, and we want their birth date. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stick a label out here. Get some windows open here. Toolbox, Properties. Okay, and this is going to say enter your name. I'll go ahead and stretch that out so that looks nice. And then I'm going to use a text field. And you can use little guidelines. You notice as I move this around, it's got little snap to guidelines to try to help you align things so that your UI elements look even. So enter your name. We can stretch that out. I don't want any text inside of there by default, and I'm just going to name this the name box up here in the identity name section so that we can reference that in the code. Before we go any further, I want to show you how to add in a new component. Now by default, if you've kind of viewed through the toolbox over here on the side, you'll notice that our iOS application template in Visual Studio does not include any kind of calendar control or component. So we're going to need to get one, and on the Xamarin website there is a components section where people have written components or extra tools and things for you to use in your applications, and you can kind of view these, pick one out, look at some example code, and go ahead and get this installed into Visual Studio so that you can use this in your applications. So the one I have picked out is called Times Square Calendar. And you can see a little picture that they've taken of the calendar. There's sample code and everything in here. We can see which versions and everything that it's going to work on. And so let's look at how to get this loaded into our application. So to get started, you'll come over to the Solution Explorer and you'll find the Components section. And you'll right click on Components and go to Get More Components. And it's going to prompt you to log in with your Xamarin account if you're not already logged in. And then it's going to launch the component store here. Now since I've already got one picked out, I can just try to search for it. So here is the one I want, and you'll notice as you go through here they're not always free. Sometimes you do have to pay for them. And you see the Add to App button. We're just going to go ahead and click that. And it's going to download that component and get it loaded in. Once the component has been downloaded and added to your project, you can come over to the Solution Explorer, open components, and you'll be able to see any components that are additional or have been added to this project. Now, components don't show up in our UI like we're used to seeing with our toolbox controls, so we'll need to add in some code in order to kind of wire this up. So I'm going to go ahead and finish putting in a label here for our birth date. Did that weird. There we go. So enter your birth date, and then we will wire up our calendar control in our code. So we'll come over to our Solution Explorer. You'll find your View Controller file. Go ahead and give that a double click. Move any windows out of the way that you need, and we will get started setting up our component and getting ready to collect the information that the user gives us. So first we'll go ahead and add in a using statement for our Times Square calendar component. So down here under our public view did load, this is where we add in code for our component. So like it says here in the comment, any additional steps after loading the view are what we will set up inside of here. And so we'll just go ahead and set up a calendar view. So we're going to need a new calendar view here. So inside of here is where I can set up this component, kind of configure this calendar view. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up what type of calendar I want. And I want a Gregorian calendar. And these are all comma separated inside of here. I have a first date property. We're going to go ahead and set that. We can go ahead and set that to now. I'm tripping all over my fingers today. There we go. So we'll just go ahead and set that to now. You can set things like first date, last date, right? And so one of the benefits of adding in these components is they'll often come with things like sample code and documentation that you can find on their particular components page on the Xamarin website. So you can kind of get some information on how to use it. We can set a background color if we wanted to mess with that. So I could do like a UI color. Go light text. And I could set up, things like paging. Probably want that. So when we're all done with this section, we end this with a semicolon here in the curly brace. So all of the different properties you want to set up inside of here, I'll go back to this calendar view object. So now that you have the component set up, we're going to set up a handler. So a handler ultimately lets us determine, upon different events that are built into the component, what do we want to have happen. So in our case, our calendar view, we're going to use the did select date. And we're going to set up some calling components here. So what do we want to have happen when they select a date? Well, we want to go ahead and collect that date in a variable. And I'm going to make it let's see, we can do a date time. So everything you want to have happen goes inside of here. This ends also with a semicolon like our section above. And then finally, we'll add the component to the view. So we do view.add and our calendar view object. So if you went ahead and gave this a test run right now, you would notice that the calendar loads, but it's loading over the top of the UI that we have already designed, which is probably not the behavior that we want. So let's look at how we would add another screen that could open so the calendar could reside separately from our original UI components. Okay, so let's look at how to set up this next screen with some navigation. So we are here in our main storyboard. We're going to come over to our toolbox and we're going to find the navigation controller under controllers and objects. And we're going to drag it just down here onto the design surface. And you can just kind of position this around a little bit so that you can see everything. Now we're going to move this navigation pointer. These little guys here are called SIGs, and they are what tell our iOS system which order these items are going to take place in. And so we're going to pick this one right here up, and we're going to move it to the other side of the navigation controller. So I just pick it up, and I drag it over here, and I let it go. And so now it resides over here. Now for our purposes, we don't need this root view controller, so we're just going to click on it and we're going to delete it. And once it's gone, you can go ahead and kind of restructure your design space. I know this gets a little tricky, especially if you're on a smaller monitor. So next, we want to make our original view controller the root view controller, which is that component that we just deleted. So basically we want to tell it that this is our main controller, our main screen. So to do this, go ahead and select your view controller, so our main storyboard that we originally opened. We're going to hold down the control key and then we're going to click inside the navigation controller. So holding down the control key, clicking the navigation controller, and then we're going to hold down the control key. Don't let up. And then we're going to drag this and we'll get this blue line that will connect the two of them. Then this context window will pop out and we'll set the relationship to root. So it will become the root view controller and we'll get another one of these SIG arrows in here. Right? Excellent. That's exactly how it works. If that's confusing, we will do it a few more times in other applications, but I know that gets tricky the first time. Now at this point, you've probably seen this title bar pop up. So now we have this title bar. We can change the title, what this says, by double clicking up here. So I'm going to call this input output. So for our calendar control, I'm going to grab a button. And I'm going to pull it over here under the enter your birth date. I'm going to make it the full width of the screen so that it takes up the whole area here. And then over here I'm going to name it calendar button. And actually, instead of that label, I'm going to just put enter your birth date as the text of the button. And I'm going to get rid of that label. I think that's a better UI choice here. So we can scoot that up just a little bit. So now my screen looks like this. Enter your name, our text field, and then a button that says enter your birth date. Okay, so we're ready to set up our next screen. I'm going to grab a view controller from my toolbox over here. And I'm just going to plop it down on the other side over here. There, now we can see what that looks like. So now I have this other view, which is what we're going to pop open when the user clicks the enter your birth date button. Something else I recommend when you're working with multiple views, let me get my properties window out, select that view controller window and then we can actually give it a name up here in the class. And so by default, this is going to be UI view controller. I'm going to call this calendar view controller. Like that. So when you have multiple views and you have all of these, and there's different kinds over here, you can see tab, table views, and stuff like that. We want to be able to differentiate them in our code. They are ultimately different classes, so it's just kind of a nice thing to think about. Then I also want to point out, if we come and check out our Solution Explorer, we can see that we now have a calendar view controller CS file over here. And so this is the backing code for that view. So since we want our calendar to show up in our calendar view controller, I ultimately want all of this code that we previously wrote in the view controller code of the main storyboard to reside over here in the calendar view controller class. And so here I am in my calendar view controller class. I set up a view did load event over here, and then all of that code that we had over here in the view did load section of the view controller, I've just moved it. And make sure to put in your using statement for that calendar control. And so the next step is going to be, how do I tell this button to open this view? So we create another transition, another seeg, between the button and the scene that we want to open. So in our main storyboard, we're going to select the Enter Your Birth Date button, and we're going to control drag from the button to the calendar view controller. So you get the blue line. Make sure you've actually selected the button first, and when you let up, it's going to give you that context menu, and it's going to ask, what do you want to do? We want to show. And so the iOS designer will then set up one of these little arrows right here on the side. This is how we know that there is a transition between these two scenes. And we get this bar up at the top that shows us that if we click back, it will take us back to the input-output main screen. So I went ahead and ran our application with the code that we have so far, so you can see what this looks like in the emulator. So we have our enter your name, our label, here's the enter your birthday button, and when we click that, we see that transition screen pops open. Here's our calendar. We can page through it and pick dates, and then when we want to go back, we can click input output, and it takes us back to the main page. So I just wanted to show you where we were at so far. And so let's go ahead and wrap up this application by selecting some information, putting some things in the text box, choosing a date, and then being able to display that information to the user. So to wrap up our application, we need to be able to collect the information the user has put into the text box here, and the information that they have selected on our calendar control, and then we want to be able to display that to the user. And so we can do that with an event. So we could set up another button on our page where it automatically shows that information. So I'm going to grab a button from my toolbox, and I'm going to pull it over here underneath the Enter Your Birth Date button. And I'm going to just make that a little larger. And then over here on Properties, we'll have it say Display User Info. And then my name, I'm just going to call this the Display button. So when the user clicks our Display User Info button, we want to take the information from the text box. Let's make a label down here so that we can display some information. So we'll have, let's leave my Properties window open. Name. Got to make that bigger. And then a label to hold their name. And you can try to use your guidelines so that snaps together nice. Probably want to make that larger just in case they give us a really big name. And then another one for the birth date that they've given us. Okay, so now that we have our items all set up here, and we are ready to accept some user input, let's look at how we'll do that. So we'll go to our display user info button, go ahead and give that a double click so that we get our click event for the button. And right now we don't have any way that we're getting data back from that calendar view controller. So that'll probably be one of the key steps that we'll need to do. But we have this text control that's right here on our form. Remember, we named it name box. And so we can just grab that name box and put that in that label. So I named it the username label, and we'll get the text property, and we'll set that to whatever is in that name box, right? So easy peasy with the controls that are just readily available on the main storyboard or on that main view. So the easiest way to pass data between two different controllers is through a custom class for our data that is ultimately known by both of our controllers so that we can store data in it and pass it back and forth. And then as our apps grow and we have multiple controllers, we can then share that data class between all of them. So I'm going to set up a custom class. Come over to my Solution Explorer. And I'm going to right click my project and I'm going to add a class. And it's going to set up a new class for us. And I'm just going to call this user data. And this is just going to be a good old-fashioned C# class, right? Nothing real special going on in here. And so you can set up any public properties that you might want to set up in here. So I could go ahead and set up a public string for name. I know we're not passing that anywhere, but it's just a good practice. And a public date time for their birth date. So once we have this user data class, we need to wire it up in our calendar view control. So right now, we are just taking that date time that we are receiving from the selected date on the calendar and putting it in a variable. And that was just so that we could test, and if you were to put a breakpoint on this line and check it out, you could make sure that you're actually grabbing a date. But what we really want to do is make sure that it gets passed over to our user data class and gets put into this public property. So up here at the top of my calendar view control, I'm just going to set up an instance of my object, and then inside view did load, I'm going to instantiate that object just to make sure that our item is ready to go. And actually I need to do this here since that's where we're going to be collecting that data. And so then I can set data.birthdate to that either the net date variable, or you could just equal it directly to this and we could take that line out altogether. So the next thing is to come over to our main storyboard, view controller, and here where we are displaying that information, then I'm going to have that birth date label text, and I'm going to have to also instantiate, or not instantiate, I'm just going to need a variable of type data or user data over here. I don't want to set up an instance of an object because I don't want to use the new, because ultimately that would create a new instance of the object. Now, unless I'm using static a static class, which then would solve my problem, which I may just go ahead and do for the sake of simplicity. So if I make this a static class, then I have the static keyword here and to my properties, and then all I did was just change this to the class name, so I don't need an object reference at all if I'm going to go with a static object. And so same thing over here, I can use user data birth date, right, in the name of simplicity. And then we have to choose how do we want this to be displayed, because it's a date-time object. Ultimately, I probably want two short date string, and you can check out the different formats of toString available to datetime in the .NET Framework, MSDN documentation if you're not real sure what that looks like. So you can go ahead and check this out and see where we are so far. And that's basically it. You can go ahead and run this, test it, check it out, make sure it works the way that you think it's going to work. If you want to change kind of some of the formatting or things of the calendar, remember we do this over here in our calendar view controller, so you can change things like what's the first date, last date, things like that that you want them to be able to select. I just did this kind of quick and dirty so you can see how it worked. I know this video is getting kind of long, so make sure to check out all the different steps and some of the links that I've posted in the lesson that goes along with this video. And feel free to get a hold of me if you have any questions.